The year 2001 was a huge year in pop culture. In film, we would see the debuts of both the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter franchises. While this was happening, Apple would release the first iPod. Meanwhile, in the world of wrestling, the Attitude Era was continuing to roll on. And with both ECW and WCW closing their doors for good, the WWF would finally win the Monday Night Wars and move on into the infamous invasion angle. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 2001, a year in review. When we last left off, Kurt Angle was the WWF champion. Both Steve Austin and The Rock were vying to see who the real face of the company was, and elsewhere in the wrestling world, World Championship Wrestling and Extreme Championship Wrestling were undergoing their death throes. As far as Vince McMahon's promotion was concerned, however, there was no danger of them going out of business, because rolling into their first pay-per-view of the year, the Royal Rumble on January 21st, it would be full steam ahead. And the undercard here would see two titles change hands when Chris Jericho defeated Chris Benoit for the Intercontinental strap in an excellent ladder match, all while the Dudley Boys were beating Edge and Christian for the tag belts. But it wasn't all title changes, as, after this, Ivory would retain her women's title against Chyna when the Ninth Wonder of the World suffered a kayfabe neck injury, all before Kurt Angle managed to get the better of Triple H when Steve Austin interfered to screw his continued rival out of the victory. Of course, that was all place setting for the main event though, as in the Rumble match itself, arguably the greatest Rumble of all time, things would be dominated by Kane during the early going, with him mowing through a number of opponents here, including, but not limited to, comedian Drew Carey. That said, as things went on and the likes of The Rock, The Undertaker, and Rikishi got involved, it would get much more heated, with each of these feeling like they could be legitimate contenders to win. In the end, however, when it was all said and done, it would be Stone Cold who would come out on top for a record third time after last eliminating Kane, booking his spot in the main event at WrestleMania as a result. But his opponent for the big show was still up in the air at this point because, while Kurt Angle still held the gold, there was another pay-per-view to go before the showcase of the Immortals came, and as such, another challenger he would be forced to contend against. And unfortunately for him, his challenger at February 25th's No Way Out would turn out to be none other than The Rock. Of course, that wouldn't be the only big match going on at this show though, because before that, Stephanie McMahon would enact some revenge over her father's latest mistress, Trish Stratus, carrying on the McMahon Civil War storyline, a storyline which had by now seen Vince repeatedly goad his kayfabe comatose wife Linda with his affairs. Then after that, Triple H and Steve Austin would settle their beef in a 3 stages of hell match, with the first fall a singles match being won by the Rattlesnake, all while the second one, a street fight, was won by the Game. So with it coming down to a steel cage bout then, both men would destroy what was left of each other, with it eventually ending with the heel knocking out Austin with a sledgehammer, then collapsing on top of him to pick up the pinfall. But winner or not, Stone Cold still had his WrestleMania World title match to look forward to. And his opponent for that would ultimately be decided when, in the main event, The Rock would end Kurt Angle's 4-month reign as champ to take the belt home for himself. So just like that, it was set up for April 1st, arguably the two biggest stars in the industry's history going one-on-one to see who the real top dog was. But this was far from the only reason WrestleMania 17 would be considered by many to be the greatest pay-per-view of all time, because aside from having the perfect main event, the undercard would be absolutely stacked too. Yes, this is generally regarded as the end point of the Attitude Era, and if it had to stop there, then what a way to go out, because pretty much everyone and everything that made the period so special was represented here, all coalescing together to create a truly magic night. And as for how it got started, well, early on we would see 4 titles change hands when Chris Jericho defeated William Regal for the Intercontinental title, Kane won the Hardcore title in a triple threat match, Eddie Guerrero pinned Test for the European belt, and Chyna finally got her revenge on Ivory when she took the women's strap from her. But that wasn't even the half of what made this show great, as after that, Kurt Angle and Chris Benoit would have a mat classic, the Hardy Boys, Dudley Boys, and Edge and Christian would raise their game even higher with TLC 2, a fun gimmick battle royal would see some names from the past return, and The Undertaker would continue his streak after beating Triple H in an excellent encounter. Then the McMahon family drama would continue when, defending his mother's honor, Shane would take on and ultimately beat his father Vince, all with a little help from Linda and Trish Stratus that was, the latter of whom turned face during the match after having had enough of the boss's misogynistic ways. But this match was about more than just the McMahons, of course, because just 6 days prior to the show on Raw, it had been announced that Vince McMahon had purchased WCW, formally ending the Monday Night Wars in the process. That said, in kayfabe, during the now famous simulcast segment between Raw and Nitro, it would be Shane who came out to the ring at the Southern Wrestling Promotions show to announce that he was in fact the new owner of WCW, and that going forward, he would be reviving the brand to take on WWF once more. So with this continuing to simmer in the background even after the match was done, it would be left to the main event to close the show, a main event which would decide who was going to be not only the face of the company, but also the WWF champion going forward. And after just over 28 minutes then, it would be the Rattlesnake who would ultimately come out on top. Although in order to do this, he would shock fans when, with the help of a steel chair, he'd turn heel and align with the evil boss McMahon himself. Yes, the sight of the two once bitter rivals shaking hands was something no one wanted to see, and as a result of this, with their hero now taken from them, many simply stopped watching in the weeks and months that followed. And it also didn't help things that the next night on Raw, The Rock would be written off of TV for a while too, so as to go film the Scorpion King, with this leaving the company with no top babyface. But what about Triple H, we hear you say? Surely he could have turned and feuded with the Rattlesnake? Well, no, because instead he would actually align himself with Austin, forming the two-man power trip in the process. And this would lead to April 29th's Backlash where, rather than seeing the newly heel Austin defending his title in a singles match, fans would instead watch as he teamed up with Triple H to take on the Brothers of Destruction, with the heels beating them here to become the tag team champions too. Elsewhere, meanwhile, the most notable things to come out of the undercard on this show would be Chris Jericho and William Regal's fun Duchess of Queensberry match, Kurt Angle and Chris Benoit's epic Ultimate Submission bout, and Shane McMahon's Last Man Standing contest against The Big Show. Aside from this, though, it was clear that, with ECW having by now gone out of business too, and there truly being no more competition left for WWF, their foot had been taken off the gas and some momentum had been lost as a result. That said, it wasn't like no one was interested in the product anymore, because when they went over to the UK for Insurrection just a few days later on May 5th, the company would draw a healthy crowd, one only too happy to see The Undertaker defeat the two-man power trip in a handicap match. And that wouldn't be the end of the heel champion's woes either, because when they returned to America thereafter, it would soon be time for May 20th's Judgment Day, where now it would be Austin and The Undertaker one-on-one for the title. But that wasn't all that was happening on this night, as prior to the main event, Kurt Angle and Chris Benoit would settle their beef in a 2 out of 3 falls match, Chyna would defend her women's title against Lita in what turned out to be her last match with the company, and Kane would pin Triple H to win the Intercontinental title the game had recently procured from Chris Jericho some weeks earlier. Still, even if the two-man power trip had lost the secondary belt, at least in the main event, Austin would be able to defeat the Dead Man, allowing them to keep the world title on their grasp. And on top of that, they also still held the tag team titles, the very titles they would defend against Chris Jericho and Chris Benoit the next night on Raw in one of the best matches in that show's history. Of course, while the babyfaces would be crowned the new champions by the end of that one, what most people remember it for now is it being the match where Triple H tore his quad, with this forcing him out of action for the rest of the year. And the injuries wouldn't end there, because just a month later, at June 24th's King of the Ring, Steve Austin would be temporarily put on the shelf too, when during his successful main event title defense, Booker T would get involved and slam the Rattlesnake through the announce table at ringside. Yes, this was one of the early moments of the invasion, something which had formally begun a few weeks prior to this on the May 28th episode of Raw, when Lance Storm interfered in a Steve Blackman and Perry Saturn match. And he wasn't the only one who showed up prior to King of the Ring, because on the June 18th episode of Raw, Diamond Dallas Page would also make his presence felt when he was revealed to be the stalker of The Undertaker's wife, Sarah. But they wouldn't face off quite yet, because at King of the Ring, it would be Shane McMahon himself who flew the flag of WCW when he had an absolutely brutal street fight against Kurt Angle. All this before the Olympic hero would then go on to the King of the Ring final, where he ultimately lost to Edge. And now, as the new King of the Ring going forward then, Edge would find himself fully representing Team WWF, as in the weeks that followed, the invasion finally kicked into high gear. How would this happen? Well, by WCW attempting to take over Raw and turn it into Nitro, something which fans were introduced to the concept of when Booker T and Buff Bagwell main evented the July 2nd episode of the Red Brand. Unfortunately though, after years of being conditioned to see the Southern wrestling promotion as lesser, WWF fans would reject this bout, leading to Vince McMahon deciding to scrap the whole concept and instead have WCW just be an invading outsider force. But even if this did seem like a home run concept, it quickly became clear to fans that Booker T and Diamond Dallas Page aside, none of the big stars from the rival company were coming in. And the reason for this was that, with guaranteed Time Warner contracts, which the boss wasn't willing to buy out after all the money he'd spent on the XFL, we wouldn't be seeing the likes of the NWO, Bill Goldberg, Sting, Ric Flair, or Eric Bischoff show up to champion the Invaders anytime soon. No, instead, we'd get mostly mid-carders like Chuck Palumbo, Billy Kidman, or Sean Stasiak, with this leaving fans everywhere feeling underwhelmed. So, realizing they needed to do something to breathe new life into the whole angle then, WWF would bring ECW into the fold, having Rob Van Dam and Tommy Dreamer join the Dudley Boys, Rhino, Taz, Raven, Lance Storm, Just Incredible, and Mike Awesome in reviving the hardcore promotion on the July 9th episode of Raw. And as if that wasn't enough, later that same night, ECW would join forces with WCW to create the Alliance, with Stephanie McMahon being introduced as the new Extreme Boss going forward from there. Yes, by now, audiences were starting to realize that the whole thing was turning into yet another McMahon family drama angle. But even that still didn't stop them watching in their droves during the Invasion pay-per-view on July 22nd where, with the war now formally hitting the ring, the show would do record buys. And what were those fans who bought the pay-per-view treated to that night? Well, a pretty good show as it happened, because with all of the WWF, one notable exception aside, now turning babyface, a series of interpromotional matches would see Billy Kidman defeat X-Pac, Rob Van Dam get the better of Jeff Hardy, and Trish Stratus and Lita score a victory over Stacy Keibler and Tori Wilson. Then after that, the main event inaugural brawl would feature a 10-man tag of Team Alliance versus Team WWF, with Booker T, DDP, Rhino, and the Dudley Boys coming together on one side, all while on the other side Chris Jericho, Kane, The Undertaker, Kurt Angle stood alongside the old Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, after spending weeks attempting to rally his top guy to return to his old badass ways once more, Vince McMahon and fans would finally get their wish when, on the Raw prior to this show, the Rattlesnake would pretty much single-handedly lay waste to the invading force, seemingly confirming his return to the side of the good guys. Of course, that would be short-lived though, as by the end of the inaugural brawl, Austin would have turned heel once more and joined the Alliance, leaving fans disappointed all over again. And what made this one even worse was that it made no sense for Stone Cold to want to return to the company that had once fired him, with it all just further exposing how weak the Alliance side of the roster was if they needed someone like Austin to prop them up. So it was lucky then that, soon after this, The Rock would make his return to WWF, aligning himself with his home team from there as he became the captain of the New York side in lieu of Austin's defection. And at the very least, this would breathe some excitement into the Invasion storyline, as at the next pay-per-view of the year, SummerSlam on August 19th, the Great One would find himself scoring a win for Team WWF when, in the main event, he pinned Booker T to become the WCW World Champion. Of course, with Steve Austin successfully defending his WWF World title against Kurt Angle on that same night, it would mean that each side now held the other's most prized possession going forward. But that wasn't the only big news of the night, of course, because in the undercard, more titles would move around. When Edge defeated Lance Storm to bring the Intercontinental title back home, Rob Van Dam bested Jeff Hardy in a ladder match to win the Hardcore title, and the Cruiserweight and Light Heavyweight belts would be unified when X-Pac, the lone heel of Team WWF by this point, beat Tajiri. That said, despite this show turning out to be a success, the Invasion storyline would be thrown into perspective when, just a few weeks later, the New York attacks would send the world into turmoil. So changing course and deciding to give the American fans a moment they could get behind then, Vince McMahon would book Kurt Angle to get his rematch with Steve Austin at September 23rd's Unforgiven, with the Olympic hero finally being able to get the better of his rival here so as to become the WWF champion. But that wasn't the only title change that happened on this night, because prior to the main event, Rhino would become the WCW United States Heavyweight Champion when he beat Tajiri, and Christian, who had only recently turned on Edge and joined the Alliance, would get the better of his now former tag team partner, taking the Intercontinental title away from him in the process. Yes, the title changes were coming thick and fast now, and given how many of them there were at this point, it could be hard to keep up with who held what at times. Hell, on the October 8th episode of Raw, Steve Austin would even win the WWF title back from Kurt Angle, ending his temporary feel-good run and returning the company to their original plans after that slight detour. One thing that was not so hard to keep up with, though, was the fact that, while the Alliance was generally struggling to seem like a threat at the best of times, one name amongst the roster was managing to rise out of the ranks as the next big star in waiting, and that was Rob Van Dam. This was why, at October 22nd's No Mercy, RVD would find himself in the WWF World title picture, there taking on Stone Cold and Kurt Angle in a triple threat match. And while he didn't win this one, it would help to elevate him to the next level, making him one of the few bright spots of the whole Invasion storyline. But he wasn't the only one rising to the next level on this show, as, in the match prior, Chris Jericho would shock the wrestling world when, as part of his inner WWF feud with The Rock, he'd take the Great One on for the WCW World title, eventually pinning him after just over 23 minutes to take the belt home for himself. That's right, there were some good things to come out of the Invasion, and had it kept going at this point, maybe something could have ultimately been salvaged out of the whole affair. Sadly though, feeling that the whole thing had largely been a flop, Vince McMahon decided it was time to pull the plug on the whole thing. And that was why, after one more stop over the UK for Rebellion on November 3rd, WWE and the Alliance would agree to a winner-takes-all match at Survivor Series, with the losing side being forced to disband forever. But if Vince thought he had all of his soldiers ready to go for this one, he was very wrong, as just weeks prior to the bout, Kurt Angle would jump ship too, teaming with the Enemy now as Shane, Stephanie, and Paul Heyman were all able to gloat over what they'd pulled off. And this led to November 18th then, where, prior to the main event, Edge would defeat Test to unify the Intercontinental and United States Championships, the Dudley Boys would pin the Hardys to unify both companies' tag team titles, and Trish Stratus would win a six-pack challenge to become the first women's champion since Chyna had vacated the belt in May. Then, with it all coming down to one 5-on-5 encounter, the main event would see Team Alliance, made up of Steve Austin, Kurt Angle, Booker T, Rob Van Dam, and Shane McMahon, take on Team WWF, made up of The Rock, Chris Jericho, The Undertaker, Kane, and The Big Show. Of course, this highlighted the big issue with the Invasion story by then, as during this final battle, only one single WCW original was in the ring. And of course, come the end, it all came down to WWF's top two guys, as Steve Austin and The Rock went at it once more, with the People's Champion ending up getting the win for his side when Kurt Angle screwed his teammate, revealing himself then to have been a double agent all along. So with the Invasion now mercifully over, and the likes of Shane, Stephanie, and Paul Heyman all kayfabe fired, WWF could finally reign tall, with them choosing to retcon much of what had happened over the past year the next night on Raw, when they quietly turned Austin babyface again and had Angle revert back to his heelish ways. Then, in one of the biggest "why didn't this happen earlier" moments in wrestling history, Ric Flair would come out the night after WCW officially died to announce that he had bought stock in WWF prior to the bout, with the result of this being he was now a 50-50 owner of the company with Vince McMahon. And that would all lead to the final show of the year where, with there only being one company left standing, it was determined that there should only be one world champion going forward too. So at December 9th's Vengeance pay-per-view, there would be a one-night tournament featuring Steve Austin, The Rock, Chris Jericho, and Kurt Angle, with the winner of this being crowned the first ever undisputed world champion. Before that would happen though, Jeff and Matt Hardy would come to blows in a sibling squabble. The Dudley Boys, who now had a new addition to their act in the form of Stacy Keibler, would defend their tag team titles against The Big Show and Kane. The Undertaker would pin Rob Van Dam to become the Hardcore Champion, and Trish Stratus would successfully defend her women's title against Jacqueline. Then, in the WWF World title match, Steve Austin would score the pinfall over Kurt Angle, with this immediately being followed up by Chris Jericho getting a surprise victory over The Rock in the WCW World title match. And with that, it came down to Austin versus Jericho to see who the undisputed champion would be, a bout which, despite it seeming like the Rattlesnake had things in hand at various points, would ultimately end when an interference spot from Booker T led to Jericho getting the win, putting him in the history books forever thereafter as the first man to unify the WWF and WCW world titles. After that, Austin would spin off into a feud with Booker that saw the two have a very memorable supermarket brawl, all while Jericho would attempt to establish himself as the top dog by taking on his first challenger. That, however, is a story for another day, because with 2001 drawing to a close at this point, we'll have to put a pin in things for now. Yes, it was an eventful year, one where, with the Attitude Era coming to an end and a once-thought home run angle of WWF versus WCW failing miserably, people began to wonder if maybe Vince McMahon wasn't as infallible as he had once seemed. And as we would see over the 12 months which followed, he would end up throwing a lot at the wall in an attempt to prove he still had that Midas touch, with some of this working, while other parts led to him being forced to get the F out. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.